to conscious living. My name is Marc Caron, and today Tasha wasn't able to join us as we are having a spontaneous interview with Ariella Daly. And Ariella is quite fascinating because she's not only a writer and a shaman, but she's a beekeeper who works as a bee shaman, which is quite fascinating to see how shamanism is connected to all animals and the plants. And I'm just really excited to speak with Ariella here today because she's doing a lot of great work with the Shift Network. She's got a course coming up, and as a big part of our community is always interested in plants and animals and consciousness. We are going to see where the bees take us today. Welcome to the program, Ariella. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Mark. It's such a wonderful honor to be on the show and see where the bees take us.
Yes, absolutely. So, bees have really come up a lot in the news lately, in the past number of years with climate change and what's happening. And shamanism is becoming more and more popular as modern medicine, or let's say the more recent medicine of the past 100 years isn't necessarily working. What really got you into bee shamanism, beekeeping, and how do bees relate to dreams and shamanism and those things?
Oh, so many things. Yes, let's see here. I think with a lot of people, you might be drawn to something, but I feel that sometimes the things that call us to our life path are stalking us. They find us. And that happened with the bees. I actually was never that interested in bees. I mean, I wasn't not interested in them. They just weren't on my mind. And about 12 years ago, someone turned me on to a folk tradition, shamanic pathway, at that time called the Path of Pollen, although it has other names because it's a folk tradition, so they often tend to have more than one name. But it ultimately is bee shamanism, and it was in the UK where they were teaching at the Sacred Trust. Naomi Lewis, Kate Sheila were teaching at the Sacred Trust this kind of very not well known aspect of women's at the time they were teaching the women's aspect of it, tradition that has its roots in places like Celtic Britain, Lithuania, where my teachers came from, and dating back to the Melissa, bee women, bee shamans, bee priestesses of ancient Greece and Minoan culture. So I had always been a big nerd for anything to do with folk traditions, with the divine feminine in ancient cultures and that sort of thing. I hadn't been seeking to become a beekeeper, but when I went out to England while I was there, a wild hive of honeybees moved into the wall behind my bed. So I came home and there were bees living in the wall. I had never seen a hive of bees. It was just phenomenal. And I quite literally started dreaming with them. They were on the other side of the wall, had access to the outside through that, which happens. Bees move into walls. They move into every cavity they can find that's warm and dry because they are suffering from habitat loss. Bees are struggling. They're in the consciousness right now. I think they're in the consciousness because they're such an obvious form of the ecological crisis we're in. Bees are responsible for about a third of our food. They pollinate the earth. They make the earth flower and bloom and bring life. They've been symbols of life and spirit in many different cultures for a long time. They're often associated with paradise and the afterlife or the worlds beyond. But on a physical level, bees are in crisis. They're in crisis because of climate change, biodiversity loss, habitat loss, the way we keep bees, pesticide use. And they're also these incredible beings that are waking us up to the climate crisis, to the ecological crisis, and also to a different form of consciousness. The way bees are, communicate, interact is in itself a teaching. So I don't think that it's just that we suddenly got interested in bees because they're having a moment in decline, but also the bees are reaching out to us as a collective saying, hey, there's a different way, pay attention.
Mm. Well, it's so true that, I was just listening to what you said, of 1/3 of the food's population, or the food's production for pollination and making it go. It's just fascinating how important they are. And I know part of, when we take a look at, I remember hearing you talking about, the hive consciousness, which I started relating to a collective consciousness. And then I started thinking of how, they're kind of like the mycelium of the skies, where they're connecting everything, and today's world, this is one thing that always strikes me so interesting, is this Western world. We get so, busy doing versus being, and I don't mean that to be a pun, we can human doings versus human being. We just lose sight and lose touch of how everything is connected and how bees are so important. I think that, as we move forward, the work that you're doing, it's exciting because, it's not something that we hear every day in terms of bee shamanism. And then one question that I did have is, you're talking about bees and pollinators. There's so many different kinds of bees. And when you're speaking of bees, are you talking a collective of all bees? And then how do they differ between, from a honeybee and what they do and their functionality in the world?
Such a great question. Also, I just have to give you a hats off to the immediate connection between the mycelia and the bees. I say the same thing, and I've had so many students who work with me in Dreamwork dream of the mycelia in relationship to bees. I kind of see the mycelia as the web below the soil and the bees tending the light web above. So beautiful example of the as above and so below interrelating.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'll thank Paul Stamets for that one and the work that we've done
Yes.
with him in the past, because he's just so brilliant. And, when I learned about how everything is connected, and the reference how mycelium connects everything through, the ground and through the dirt and the soil. And then when I heard your talk on the Shift Network that you did last week, that was just that's what came into my mind. It's like the mycelium of the sky. And
Exactly.
then I get myself imagining, if you had a GPS tracker and you can track every bee and everywhere they went and what they touched and what they did,
Oh,
what we
that would
could
be
learn from
incredible.
that.
Oh,
Yeah,
it'd be such a web. It'd be so beautiful.
absolutely.
Paul Stamets' work is actually really important for the bees. He's discovered that the bees actually heal themselves from one of the things that the viruses that they're dying from
Mm.
through drinking mycelia. So
Oh, very interesting.
yeah, he's on the forefront of what might actually save the bees, among other things. But yeah, the honeybees are what I'm speaking to, and in particular, Apis mellifera. So Apis mellifera is the European honeybee, originated actually in Central Africa and migrated north to Central Europe, where there has been a long-standing culture in many different folk traditions that honor and are dedicated to the bee. So you'll see a lot of bee-centric cultures in Eastern Europe. There's a strong, especially Lithuania, which was one of the last places to be Christianized. So there's a really strong folk tradition connected to honeybees there. You'll see it in Celtic Britain. You'll see it even in as far north as Scandinavia, Norse culture. But there are 8 other species of honeybee in other parts of the world, particularly Asia. And then there are native bees. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge the native bees. They tend to be ground bees living in the ground. They tend to be solitary bees. There are only a couple other kinds of hives that are, or bees that are hive bees, like the bumblebee. There is, I think, 1 or 2 other types of bees that make honey or collect nectar, but the thing about honeybees is that they are the most prolific. They are very efficient because they are a hive, and because of the way they communicate with the flowers and with their hive about the flowers. They're very, very efficient pollinators, which is why they've been used for so long to pollinate. I think the plight of bees actually wakes us up to native bees and helps us connect with planting pollinator gardens that aren't just for honeybees, but also address other pollinators, including ground bees and solitary bees. And people are actually even getting into something called bee hotels, which are little structures made with different natural materials that are meant to be homes for native bees. So yeah, but bee shamanism in particular is referring to Apis mellifera and the honeybee culture that existed in ancient Greece and was very connected to the melissa, which means honeybee. I think I've said that already. It's also the name of one of their very favorite herbs, melissa, lemon balm.
Very interesting. So now you're a beekeeper yourself now.
Mhm.
How do you find that to be? I also read, I think I read it somewhere about you in regards to when you first went to a beehive or what have you, got completely surrounded by bees and you immediately had this sense of no fear of getting stung.
Yes, yes. One of my dear friends and mentors, Mikhail Thiel, was teaching a workshop around Rudolf Steiner's connection to bees and biodynamic agriculture, biodynamic beekeeping, that sort of thing. And it was at a place called the Melissa Sanctuary here in Sonoma County. He had a beautiful kind of hive called the sun hive, which is a round hive. It looks kind of like an egg. Remember those little Easter eggs that you had as kids that open up? It's like that. And it's a skep style, meaning it's a woven beehive. And this round shape actually really supports the being, the organism. The honeybee is a wombic kind of creature. They live in a round chamber with many panels that are the comb that they live on, where they raise their young and keep their honey. The boxes that we keep bees in today with stacks aren't really to the best benefit of the bee. So that he took this thing apart, and the comb was hanging down off the top part of the egg shape, and the bottom was filled with bees. And I was sitting right next to him in a tank top and a long flowing skirt. And he goes, I want to show you a trick. And he hit the bottom of the hive, and all the bees kind of flew up into the air in a clump, and then they were supposed to just land on the ground and then crawl back into the hive. But the wind came up at that moment. Speaking of kind of strange moments where the elemental forces dictate our experience, the wind came up, and it was just enough to send a gust of bees down on me. So, now I have a few hundred bees crawling all over me, and the guy next to me got freaked out and got stung, but I just started to dance with them. It was a very truly ecstatic experience. And I knew that they could sting me, and I knew that they wouldn't. I remember just starting to shift and move, and I suddenly had this understanding of the Melissa bee women and their bee dances. And some of the oldest artifacts we have of them are of these women dancing, and sometimes they're holding snakes, and there's this beautiful communion with nature happening. So that was my introduction to the honeybees. That was before they even moved into my house.
Oh, it's all right, eh? Yeah, because I was gonna, kind of correlate those two as how, nature's calling, it's sending messages, and I think it's important that we listen to them.
Absolutely. So many beekeepers say, I didn't really choose beekeeping, the bees chose me. And I feel that way. I think a lot of people are being drawn to reconnect with the way we can be with nature in our own backyards. And so there's organic gardening happening, there's rooftop gardening happening, there's people keeping chickens in the middle of the city. And beekeeping is just another facet of that. We've sort of lost our connection with that for a while, but people have been living with bees for millennia. It's people have been living with bees since the beginning.
Absolutely. Well, and that gets me into, a couple of things that I wanted to touch on. Is I like what you said about the way that this mentor leading his workshop had a different hive, because it sounds like he was looking to mimic more of an original or natural beehive versus these, kind of Western boxes to make things easy for harvesting honey.
Mhm.
right? So I love the ingenuity there, which is just kind of a comment. But how can people today, because you talk about rooftop gardens and our gardening and things of that nature, how can we, if we don't necessarily have the space to keep bees and things, we've gotten so colonial where we cut our grass and we don't let things flower, pollinate, and
Mm.
all of, things like dandelions and clover become pests, and weeds when they're actually super powerful healing plants that serve all the insects, not just the bees,
Absolutely. It's
right?
really true. Yeah. As much as possible, I encourage people to plant for pollinators, but also to let things go to seed sometimes, let them flower, let the dandelions happen. A lot of people are limited based on where they live and can't necessarily keep bees, although I've heard of people having bees on their like Brooklyn balconies. What I say to that is, even just one little potted window plant of rosemary is something. The bees like to eat what we like to eat. So all your culinary herbs, all your garden foods tend to be what they like. But on top of that, if you really want to get into beekeeping, um, there are so many wonderful initiatives out there where people are looking to cross pollinate, pun
Yeah.
intended. So perhaps there's a school or a college or a local community farm, and they don't have bees, and you could come in and connect with potentially starting a hive there. So that's one of the way people who don't have the access to beekeeping in their backyard connect with beekeeping.
Great. Yes. I like your puns, it's so fun to play with words in that sense. So let's take a look. One thing I want to talk about quickly is honey and
Mm.
honey production. In what I saw this documentary one time when actually that was warning us to be really careful about the honey that you buy,
Yeah, yeah.
because so much of it isn't even really honey.
If you can buy raw local honey, that's going to be the best. People look for it because it actually helps with allergies. Honey is, so let's talk, what is honey, first of all, right? So,
Mhm.
honey comes from nectar, and nectar is that sweet inducement from the flower that draws the bees in. As they're collecting the nectar, they're pollinating the flowers. And so there's this courtship, this little love affair happening at all times between the flowers and the bees. And the bees are so in such communion with the flowers that one of the things that honeybees do is when that nectar is all all done. It can't, a flower doesn't have constant nectar. During a
Mhm.
drought, there's less nectar, for instance, and different times of day they sort of fill up and then it gets drained by the bees. So when a bee drinks the last drop of the nectar for that time period for that flower before she's able to create more, he or whatever it, um, the bee will leave a scent marker, a little pheromone scent marker on the flower saying this one's empty, and it will remain, that scent will remain until the flower has re-upped its. We use a lot of feminine language in the bee tradition, so I'm trying to be
Well, that's
aware of
okay.
that, until that flower has become full of nectar again. So that's one of those amazing things about the evolution of bees and flowers. The bee will then take that honey or that nectar, which is not yet honey, through her stomach. She'll take it back to the hive. She'll share it with another sister. She'll run that through her honey, through her stomach, bringing in different enzymes. Again, she'll give it to another sister. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 sharings of the nectar, it'll go into the communal vats or the honey, the nectary store, where bees will fan their wings to reduce through evaporation the water content in the nectar. And then once that happens, once it gets to about 20%, then it's honey. So it's a very labor inducive, like there's a lot of labor that goes into creating honey. That honey isn't just honey, though. It isn't just nectar. It's got enzymes in it. It's got pollen bits in it. So when you take that in, you're taking in this mix of the different medicines from the land, distilled, you're taking in bits of pollen, which help with allergies. Unfortunately, there are honeys that are imported that are mixed with corn syrup and that sort of thing. So when you eat raw local honey, you really are getting a medicine versus honey that's been pasteurized, where all of those powerful enzymes and pollens have been filtered out and cooked out. So that's the deal with honey.
Support your local farmers.
Yes, exactly.
Always, as much as you can. So I don't mean to sound like a foolish question, but it just dawned on me as you were sharing this. What do bees use honey for? You know, like in nature, they're not just feeding the bears. You know, we commercialize it. What's the purpose of honey for the bees?
So many people ask this question, and it's a really vital question because we consume it. So for us, it's sweet and it's wonderful and it's medicinal even. For the bees, it is their lifeblood. The bees, honey is food. Honey is medicine. Honey is what they use to have energy. So it's what's consumed mainly by the adult bees, although they do feed a little bit of honey to the larvae. And it's their food source. So if they don't get enough honey gathered in the spring and summer and early fall, they won't survive. They'll starve in the winter because it's the only thing that they eat to then keep warm. So for instance, they eat honey, they can fan their wings, shake their bodies to keep the hive warm during the winter. That's how they stay warm, is through vibration and movement. When they eat honey in the spring, they can transform that honey, bring it, through their body, transform it through their fat body, and make little wax pellets or little wax scales that are secreted out of their body. Those scales become part of the honeycomb, and on the comb itself, when they build, that's their body. That's what they live on. That's where they raise their young. That's where they store water. That's where they store pollen, which they feed their babies. That's where they store honey, which again, they need to survive. So without that honey, they couldn't build. And without building, the hive again wouldn't survive. Honey is their lifeblood. Yeah.
It just dawned on me. It's like, what do they really use it for? I learned something really important there today, because it made sense that it was their food source, but I never think of bees naturally through the winter and how they maintain themselves. Now, here's an interesting side question that come up, because I've met some, honey is a plant medicine, through the bee. And I know vegetarians, they're fine, with, in general, many of them consuming honey, but I've met vegetarians who won't consume honey because it comes from the bee.
Sure.
So do you have any kind of comments on that and where that kind of draws the line? Or?
Well, I can't speak to each person's individual choice around the consumption of a food or not. I teach natural beekeeping, which as a rule tends to involve a little bit less. The honey isn't necessarily the point. So I'm keeping bees to help support the bees, to pollinate the gardens. Honey is a benefit. It's a lovely bonus, but I'm not keeping bees in a way that's going to maximize on honey production for the person, for the human. Commercial beekeeping does. And so that does harm the bees. And in part that's because of these pollinator events that we have. And so this is actually, it gets a little controversial what I'm going to say, but it's tricky for vegans because eating or not eating honey, yes, that may or may not cause harm to the bees by eating honey. But actually what causes more harm to the bees is the nut industry. Yes. So what happens in the spring, in the early spring, February in California, is that bees are trucked in on massive semi-trucks from around the even Canada, but all over the states. And they're brought in, you can see it in California at any point, or on the I-80 or wherever you are, you'll see a truck at a gas station. Someone was just telling me, I saw this February, where the truck stopped and then it pulls away and thousands of bees are left behind without their home, just milling about, and they're all going to die. Without their home, they can't survive. So bees die in the pollination events. Then these bees are brought to these fields that are all one food. Bees are just like us. Food is medicine. plants are medicine. Each plant has particular qualities that help our immune system and help bring vibrancy. Bees are the same. They need a diverse flora. They need a diverse food source. When they're only allowed to eat one thing for 3 weeks, their immune systems get compromised. Then beekeepers supplement their food. They take the honey and they supplement it with corn syrup. So they're being fed sugar or corn syrup, which is not their food source. And that tends to affect the pH of their gut. So they're not all that different than us, right?
Mhm.
And on it goes. And there's so many bees get diseases, get weakened, hives die from these large-scale commercial beekeeping endeavors. So what I have to say to people who choose to eat honey or not is, it's wonderful that you're doing you're eating the way that you want to eat in support of your body and in support of nature. But to really solve it, we have to look at how we keep food, how we make and grow food in the United States or in the world. And that's where, again, supporting your local farmer, eating local, eating organic is so helpful to the bees as well as to you.
Well, really love and appreciate how you said that in keeping bees, it's not the purpose of creating, honey. Honey is a beautiful byproduct of what you're doing, because the impact of the bees just throughout its environment and where it is incredible. And I know last year when I started tuning into this even more, I did I did a no mow May.
Yeah.
And I was thinking November, and I was looking at, so I didn't mow the lawn for all of May. And it was all for the bees, the insects, for all the pollinators, so that they would have it. I was living in a fairly populated area of Vancouver. So I thought that was one of my little options to, serve the pollinators and the bees. And then I always left a patch that always grew in the lawn. And
we do the same thing.
yeah,
No mow May.
I moved recently out to Maple Ridge on a beautiful acreage, and I did the same thing. I got a lot of grass to cut, but I left some trails and do some things, so it wasn't so colonial and just so, stereotypical of the past 50 plus years. And it's just its character, and people love it. It's you come in and you see all the different flowers and clover and daisies and buttercups, everything just growing, and it's a beautiful meadow. And I think that there's something to be said to restore and get back to nature in that way. So
absolutely, there's some really amazing initiatives out there that look at bringing the meadow back, basically. Sarah Bee Girl, she's on Instagram, does some amazing work with meadows. There's a woman in Holland who's created the Honey Highway, which is taking the median, where it's just kind of grass, nothing much growing between highways, and turning them into meadows for pollinators. There are cities like Boston and Oslo that have pollinator highways that are basically like plots of gardens that go out to the wilds, that are tracks for the bees to have access in and out. There's just so many ways. I mean, people do it in neighborhoods. You can do it in your own neighborhood where you don't spray and you have these pollinator plants. So it's just such a fun thing to see too, to see the life come back, and the other beautiful native bees, those little iridescent green ones, and the cute little bumblebees come on back.
Absolutely. So, hey, conscious living challenge to everybody watching out there, either live right now or in the future, whether you're listening anywhere in the world. What can you do to help the bees and the pollinators in your local area?
That's right.
Small actions can, have huge results, especially in nature. And the way that everything's interconnected. I just like to inspire people to see, what can you do? And if you can, then please do something, and even share it with us and, on Facebook or anywhere out there, because we'd always be interested to hear and see. Now, Ariella, I met you through the Shift Network. I've been looking at a lot of their events, and I started looking at different ways through this whole pandemic of doing things. And as an events organization, as everything was kind of drying up for a little while in terms of live in person. I discovered the Shift Network and the things they were doing, which I just really love, and I see what you're doing there. And you just recently did a talk, and I watched the video and the interview with the president and founder of Shift Network, and it was about bee shamanism, and specifically you talk about dream work.
Mm,
Maybe you can share with us how bees and dreaming are interrelated.
sure. Yeah. So, of course, as I've spoken to, bee shamanism has its ancient roots, but it's also an ever evolving, ever new tradition. It's a living pathway. So we work with the bee as a central ally or a central motif. You don't have to be a beekeeper to connect with the bees. The bees are symbols in many cultures, including this one, of the vibrant earth, of the divine feminine or the feminine principle. A beehive is mostly all female with a queen or a mother. And they are also very connected to what we might call the spirit world or the other world, if we were using maybe Celtic terminology, of that thin veil between this world and the next that's all around us, that permeates all things. So there's the spirit of the trees and the spirit of the water and the spirit of your home and the spirit of the bee women who came before, the Melissa. There's all these different ways that we can engage. And the bees have been seen, again, all the way back to ancient Egypt as, and Mesopotamia, as these beings that can go between the worlds and connect us with spirit or connect us with the divine, whether that's the divine cosmos or the divine of the earth itself. Bees also tend the garden of the earth. So there's this beautiful motif in this work that we do, that we can work with the earth as a garden, but we can also work with our own body as a temple and a garden itself, and cultivate and heal the various what we call interior roses of the body through meditation and through dream work. So this is all getting back to dream work. When we talk about the bees as beings that exist in the betwixt and between, that can tend the spirit realm and the physical realm, we also can look at them as dream bringers, as beings that connect us to collective dreaming and intentional dreaming. So collective dreaming, when we started talking about the mycelia and the bees and how they're this mirror to each other, tending this web of life. Well, the bees are also connected to this web that is called the dream weave in the bee shamanism tradition. And the dream weave itself is connected to this idea of the dream of the earth, or the great dream. You know, dream of the earth, we hear Thomas Berry speaking about that as well, this great dream of existence. We ourselves are part of that dream. We are the earth dreaming. And by intentionally choosing to invite the bees into your dreaming, you're connecting in with that greater interconnective, interspecies, and physical and spirit, these ways of bridging. Bees are a bridge species, so they bridge us between the spirit world and this world, between our animal body and our thinking mind, between ourselves as an individual and the greater collective. And so dream work is a major part of bee shamanism. Everything we do in the day, we integrate at night through our dreaming and connect with spirit in that way.
Beautifully said. And I love the way you talk about how they bridge the world and that veil.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think all nature does that better than most of us, sleeping humanoid.
Mm-hmm.
And when we wake up and see the interconnectivity of all things, like we say, that hive consciousness and that mycelium of the sky, how that interweaves with us as spirit and that full-on connection. So thank you for sharing. And you just clarified another question in what you're sharing there, when you were referring to the bees as she's earlier, and says, "Oh, I just called her a she," and then they're definitely a feminine essence if they're mostly female bees and then the queen, though there are male bees, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. I can talk about them because I just have like a little flag always flying for the drones. Um, so two things about the drones. One is that in commercial beekeeping, which commercial beekeeping informs hobbyist beekeeping. We have to remember that. So that's why natural beekeeping is sort of it's looking at how do bees live in nature and how can we emulate that. Commercial beekeeping, the drone bees, the male bees, are considered not that important. They're seen as kind of lazy, that all they do is eat honey. The honey is supposed to be for the beekeeper, and therefore they are culled, as in killed off by the beekeepers. In the cycle of life that is the hive is predominantly female. The females build, they collect, they forage, they do all of the work. That's why they're called worker bees, but that's factory language from the Industrial Revolution, and I'd prefer not to use that. So they're the female bees. The queen or the mother is in service to the hive, laying eggs where the female bees say, we want drones here, we want females here. The drones are raised in the summer, and then they're the sacrificial kings. They die in the spring, the fall, the bees kick them out of the hive because they need to survive the winter in just a small cluster. So there's this beautiful metaphor that we often see in things like Celtic mythology, where there's the death of the summer king and the kind of rise of the crone or the feminine energy of the winter. But that's aside. Here's what I think is really interesting about the drones. The drones are emissaries of peace. I believe Jacqueline Freeman in the Song of Increase talks about that. The drones are an energy that can go between other hives. So female bees can't go to other hives. They'll get kicked out. They'll be guarded by other female bees. You're not allowed in. But the drones can pass between. And what they do as a result is they end up bringing back the wisdom and the knowledge of the entire ecosystem to the hive. If there's disease in the area, the bees find out. If there's, wellness and the song of joy, they know. So the drones are, they're really important to beekeeping and to the overall collective of the hive, which is predominantly female.
Mm-hmm. Lucky drone bees, I would say.
Yes. Oh, and they're also for mating. Like they mate with the queens out in the.
And that's just it. That's it. The other female bees don't reproduce. Only the queen. Is that correct?
Only the queen reproduces. She goes on a nuptial flight, it's called, at the beginning of her life, and she mates. Usually, it's 2 or 3 days. She mates with up to sometimes like 70 different drones from other hives to promote genetic diversity. Mm-hmm. And those drones are part of what become the patrilines of the hive. And some will have, maybe better skills of carrying the skills of foraging. Some will be carrying the skills of stronger immune systems. So it's really important that that diversity is there. Then she goes back to the hive and she really never leaves again until she reproductively swarms as a colony. So she carries both the male and female principle within her, the sperm and the egg at all times once she's mated, and lays eggs according to that. So if she lays an egg that isn't fertilized, it's a drone. And if she lays an egg that she fertilizes, it's a female.
Wow, very interesting. I love learning so many new things. And I think one thing I just really want to reiterate, something you said that I think is really important when you take a look at commercial and industrial beekeeping, how they cull these bees, and that's part of the natural life cycle. So I really appreciate what you're sharing, teaching, and promoting is, the how does nature do it? Let's do it in the same way, because that's going to be a much more natural, result of harmony and just everything else that it does. So I think that that's really a powerful and important thing for everybody to understand, because it happens so much in industrial food production. And the more we can support our local farmers, the more we can support, natural and organic growing, the healthier we will be as, as a collective consciousness, as our own human hive consciousness. And we're seeing that within immune systems and stuff just in the past, 18 months. It's been a really interesting world. So do the bees have an impact on how the world has been in the past 18 months?
You'll have to say that again in terms of, do you mean in terms of the pandemic we've gone through?
Yeah. How have they been affected or how have they benefited?
Okay. I would say that one of the things that's happened during the pandemic is that people have had more time, which means there are a lot more people interested in bees and beekeeping. I think if done responsibly and sort of honoring the wisdom of the bees, the more people who are living with bees and that's just part of their life, the better, because the bees bridge us between beekeeping in the natural world. You can't be a beekeeper and not pay attention to climate change. You can't be a beekeeper and not pay attention to the seasons or what's growing. It connects you to nature. It calms your nervous system. Sitting with bees is a very calming thing for many people. And so a lot of people have started to reconnect through beekeeping during this time. I would not say that anything slowed down in terms of commercial beekeeping, unfortunately, but I do think that there's been a little bit more room for, we've seen people spending more time gardening, spending more time at home doing, cooking and sort of that sort of thing. So bees have been a part of that.
Beautifully said. Now, you've got an interesting course that you are doing with the Shift Network, and I want to share it only because I think it's important for those people who want to know more about bees, bee shamanism, Dreamwork, and really just connect with you and your work, because I think it's important and I think it's beautiful, and bees are super important. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what this program is that you put together. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it starts on July 12th with the Shift Network. Is that correct?
It does. Yeah. Yeah. So this is a course that's not about beekeeping. I do teach beekeeping, but this one is really about your own interior wisdom. So connecting you to your body and working with dreams. It's an intentional dreaming course, dreaming with bee shamanism. And we are working with this idea of dreaming with the bees, inviting the bees in to inform our dreaming. It's a 7-week course. And we'll be visiting within the course 3 of the what we might call knowledge centers of the body. Within this tradition, there are energy centers, just as we see in other traditions, such as the chakric system. So there are energy centers within the body. We call them roses and stars. And we seek to cultivate our own garden from within. And by working with 3 of these centers, we'll be working with the brow, the heart, and the sacral center. We are not only infusing them through various meditations and practices with life force energy and connecting to the body as a tool and a temple, but we're also then dreaming for deeper information about our own life's path, about these centers of knowing, and how to heal and revivify and transform. Each week we'll have a different dreaming intention. So for part of it, we'll be dreaming with each of those. And then we'll also be working with the spirit of the overall hive, sisterhood of the hive, both the bees themselves and the Melissa bee women, who are in these ways connected to 3 different primary sisterhoods. You could think of them as 3 primary teachings. So the teachings of the sisterhood of the spinners is one, connecting this to weaving magic, like the way the bees weave the dreams together, or weave the dream weave, or connect with the weavings of the mycelia, as we've spoken to. There's the sisterhood of the wise maidens, which is the sisterhood most connected to healing and wisdom and knowledge, and the way that's stored in the hive, and how we can receive wisdom and knowledge from the bees in the hive, both metaphorically and quite literally. And then there's the sisterhood of the Fae, which is a term used, you find it in French and Celtic culture. The Fae folk are nature spirits, basically, or the nature beings, and we work with the sisterhood that's most intimately connected with these nature beings as a way to connect with nature, the raw elements of nature, and the inherent eros in nature, which we see in the relationship between the bee and the flower. So that's some of what we'll be looking at.
Awesome. Well, I know you talked about it again in some detail for those people who want to, tune into the Shift Network and see what you're doing with them. The links are below here or up here in the discussion or in the comments and the description of these videos, whether you're watching on YouTube or on our consciousliving.org website or wherever that might be. There are links there. You can register there, as well as I see you've got also a Q&A on Monday, July 6th with the Shift Network as well, where people can tune in on Facebook and ask you some questions.
Sure thing. Yeah.
Cool.
In the meantime, you're all invited to just try it out. Try inviting bees in as dream bringers. Just see what that feels like.
Yeah, and I would even suggest, meditate with the bees, take some time outside. If you haven't given it any thought and we've inspired you to, consider the bee a little bit more consciously, go take some time and meditate with the bee. And, these Buddhist type walking meditations and things of just being present have always been a great experience for me because, people get, I don't have time to meditate. I can't do all that. You can meditate just in the garden. And meditation doesn't mean oming all the time and doing different things. You can just connect with the bee and honor the bee and watch the bee, right? Be present with the bee.
Truly. To simply observe a single bee moving from flower to flower is a meditation. To close your eyes and listen to the hum below a flowering tree that the bees are pollinating is a meditation. And that presencing really allows a different way of being and seeing to come into your life.
Nice. So what would you say is the most important the most important thing people can do just to support the bees? Like say, you don't have to, go on a course or do anything or be a beekeeper. What's by far, if there was one thing anybody can do anywhere in the world to help support the bees, what would you suggest they do?
It's a tandem one thing, but it's stop using pesticides and plant for pollinators. Yeah. Like I said, even if it's just one little plant, it's a contribution.
Fantastic. And your hope for the world and the bees and everything that you see as we wrap up moving forward, for the world, what's your hope for the world, the bees and everything that is?
I believe that we have it in ourselves to truly become stewards of the earth again, to become guardians of this sacred blue-green jewel. And so my hope for the bees is actually a hope for humanity, that we find a way to knit ourselves back into our place within nature, to become stewards in whatever way you are able to in your life, even if that's just through educating yourself more about something that brings you alive, whether it's bees or whales or a certain plant or whatever it is. It's that curiosity that brings passion, that brings devotion. And our devotion to this flowering earth is what I pray for more than anything.
Thank you. And tell our listeners where they can get a hold of you.
Great. Yeah. So you can find me on my website, which is honeybee, as in BEE, honeybeewild.com, or you can find me on Instagram, where I write a lot about bees, beekeeping, and bee shamanism, as well as my cute new 4-month-old daughter. That's at Beekeeping in Skirts. So Instagram, Beekeeping in Skirts. Those are the two places I'm most prevalent.
Fantastic. Well, Ariella, I just really want to thank you for the work that you do for the bees, which means for the planet, which means for humanity, which means for the greater hive consciousness, the collective consciousness of all that is. I really thank you and appreciate you taking the time today to have this conversation and to share more about the importance of bees, bee shamanism, dreams, and how we can make a difference just in our own lives to affect the bees, which then changes the world. So thank you very much for your work.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for asking such vital and important questions about pollinators and how we can connect and how we can support. It's been an honor to be on the show. I really appreciate you inviting me here.
No, it was my pleasure, and thank you very much again for joining us. My name is Marc Caron, and you've been watching Conscious Living, airing here on 100.5 FM CFRO